My name is Natalie, 33 years old, and a senior forensic auditor who catches financial criminals for a living. Yet the most devastating fraud I ever encountered was sleeping in my own bed. My husband demanded a divorce in the middle of a crowded pediatric clinic. He looked at me with dead eyes and declared he was taking our $1 million Aspen mansion, the luxury cars, and our entire investment portfolio. The only thing he explicitly refused to take was our 6-year-old son, calling his medical needs a sinking financial ship. He expected me to shatter into pieces and beg him to stay. My lawyer later begged me to fight him for every penny. Instead, I stood before a judge and calmly gave him exactly what he asked for. He smiled a victorious smirk, completely unaware that I had just handed him the keys to his absolute ruin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had your heart ripped out by the person who promised to protect you and your child, hit the like button and subscribe. You will want to see the exact moment his arrogance turns to absolute terror. The fluorescent lights of the Chicago Pediatric Clinic buzzed above me with an annoying hum. I sat in a hard plastic chair, clutching the small hand of my 6-year-old son Leo. Leo was completely deaf in his left ear and rapidly losing hearing in his right. We were there for the final preoperative appointment to schedule his cochlear implant surgery. It was a day I had been praying for and working toward for over a year. The surgery required a massive $45,000 deposit up front. I had spent the last 7 years working late into the night, auditing massive corporate tax files and missing weekends just to pay off the heavy business loans my husband took out to start his real estate company. I had been the reliable income that kept our family afloat while he chased his dreams. Recently, I had worked grueling 60-hour weeks just to ensure our joint medical savings account was fully funded for this exact medical moment. The receptionist, a kind older woman named Brenda, called us to the billing counter. Leo tugged at my skirt and signed the word for happy. I signed it back to him and handed Brenda my platinum joint credit card. She swiped the card through the machine. The screen beeped and flashed red. Brenda frowned and tried wiping the magnetic strip against her uniform before swiping it again. It beeped again. "I am so sorry," Mrs. Natalie, Brenda said in a low voice. "The card is being declined. It says insufficient funds." My stomach dropped. That was impossible. I checked the balance just 2 days ago, and the account held over $60,000. I pulled out my phone to open my banking app, my hands shaking slightly. Before I could log in, the heavy glass doors of the clinic swung open. My husband Bradley walked in. He was 35 years old and looked like the quintessential successful real estate developer. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, and a gold watch gleaming on his wrist. He did not look like a man whose son was about to undergo life-changing surgery. He looked like a man preparing to close a ruthless corporate deal. I rushed over to him, feeling a wave of relief. "Bradley, thank goodness you are here." The joint card just declined at the desk. Did the bank flag it for fraud because of the large amount? Bradley did not reach out to hug me. He did not even look down at Leo, who was happily waving at him from the counter. Instead, Bradley stared at me with an expression so devoid of warmth, it literally chilled my blood. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached into the inner pocket, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He did not hand it to me gently. He dropped it directly onto my lap. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the heavy envelope. "Those are divorce papers," Bradley said. His voice was loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear. "I am filing for dissolution of marriage effective immediately." I stood frozen. The ambient noise of the clinic seemed to completely fade away. My brain, trained to analyze complex financial data and catch corporate discrepancies, simply could not process the information in front of me. My husband of 7 years was handing me divorce papers, while our deaf son sat 3 feet away, waiting for his surgery deposit. Bradley did not lower his voice or show a single ounce of shame. He stood tall and began listing his demands right there in front of the receptionist and 3 other families. "I am taking the Aspen mansion," he announced casually. "I am keeping all 3 luxury vehicles. and I am retaining 100% sole ownership of Apex Holdings and the entire family investment fund. You can take whatever is in your personal checking account, but the big assets belong to me. I felt the air completely leave my lungs. You are taking everything. What about Leo? What about the money for his surgery today? Bradley actually scoffed. He looked down at our son with a mixture of annoyance and pure disdain. I am surrendering all parental rights to you. You wanted a kid, you deal with the consequences. I am a busy man, Natalie. I need a fresh start, not broken baggage. Leo's medical issues are a sinking financial ship, and I refuse to be dragged under by it. You have full custody. Do not even think about asking me for child support because my lawyers will tie you up in court until you are completely bankrupt. I could not believe the monster standing in front of me. Leo looked up at me with his big brown eyes, completely unaware that his father had just condemned him to a world of silence. The cochlear implant was his only chance at hearing my voice again. It was a narrow medical window, and Bradley knew exactly how critical this payment was. You emptied the medical fund, I stated. It was not a question. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. You drained the account meant to give your own son his hearing back. Bradley checked his gold watch with an impatient sigh. I relocated those funds to a more secure investment. Madison is waiting for me in the car outside, and she hates when the engine idles too long. Madison. The name echoed in my head like a physical blow. His 24-year-old administrative assistant. The girl barely out of college who fetched his coffee. I had met her at his company holiday party just 3 months ago. She had smiled in my face, complimented my dress, and played with Leo. All while she was sleeping with my husband and plotting to take my life. He was abandoning his family and stealing his son's medical funds to run off with an assistant. Read the papers, Bradley sneered. Sign them quickly if you know what is good for you. Try to fight me for the real estate or the company, and I will make sure you cannot even afford rent in this city. He turned on his heel and walked out the glass doors, leaving me standing in the middle of the clinic with a declined credit card, a deaf child, and a shattered life. He thought he had destroyed me completely. He thought my silence was submission. But as a forensic auditor, I knew one fundamental truth about arrogant men who steal. They always leave a paper trail and they never read the fine print. I scooped Leo into my arms, holding him tight against my chest as we walked out of the clinic. The crisp Chicago wind hit my face, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was already racing, calculating, shifting into the gear I usually reserved for unraveling corporate embezzlement schemes. Bradley thought he had broken me. He assumed his aggressive ambush would leave me paralyzed with fear. I strapped Leo securely into his car seat, handed him his favorite visual puzzle book, and drove straight to the primary branch of our bank downtown. I needed physical, undeniable proof. I marched through the heavy brass doors and went directly to the teller window. I asked for a full time-stamped printout of the transaction history for our joint medical savings account. The teller, a young man named Kevin, who had helped us set up the fund years ago, typed my credentials into the system. His hand suddenly stopped on the keyboard. He looked at the screen and his face fell into a mask of pure pity. He printed the statement, stamped it for official verification, and pushed the paper across the cold marble counter. I looked down. The balance was exactly zero. A single outgoing wire transfer of $60,000 had been executed at exactly 8 in the morning. I demanded to know the destination of the wire. Kevin hesitated, checking his screen again, but as a joint account holder, I had the legal right to every detail. The funds had been wired directly to a high-end luxury auto dealership in the wealthy Gold Coast district. The memo line on the transfer was typed out with brutal clarity. It read, "Down payment for Portia Carrera Madison." My husband had stolen the money meant to restore his son's hearing to buy a sports car for his 24-year-old mistress. I walked out of the bank with the crisp printed statement burning a hole in my hand. I stood next to my car, taking a deep, steadying breath. Before I could even open the door, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID flashed the name Patricia, my wealthy, deeply image-obsessed mother-in-law. I answered the call, expecting her to express absolute horror at what her son had just done. I assumed Bradley had bragged about the divorce, but I figured a grandmother would at least pretend to care about the canceled surgery. I was gravely mistaken. Natalie, Patricia said, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. Bradley just called me. He told me he finally served you the papers. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Patricia, your son just drained Leo's medical fund. He took the money for the cochlear implants and bought a luxury car for his mistress. Patricia did not gasp. She did not express an ounce of outrage. Instead, she let out a dry, dismissive sigh that made my blood run cold. Oh, stop being so overly dramatic, Natalie. Bradley works incredibly hard. He deserves to enjoy the fruits of his labor. She continued, her tone sharpening into a cruel sneer. Let us be completely honest here. You have let yourself go. You spend every waking moment obsessing over that boy and his endless medical appointments. Bradley is a highly successful developer. He needs a flawless woman by his side, someone who can host charity galas and entertain his elite investors. He does not need a stressed-out mother who constantly drains his financial resources on a disabled child. You should be grateful he stayed with you this long. Just sign the papers quietly and do not make a scene. The absolute cruelty of her words hung in the freezing winter air. She was calling my beautiful, intelligent son a drain on resources. She was validating her son's infidelity and blatant theft simply because I was too busy being a dedicated mother to play the role of a shallow trophy wife. You are right, Patricia, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. Bradley deserves exactly what is coming to him. I hung up the phone before she could utter another toxic word. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a useless waste of energy. Energy was a resource I needed to conserve for the absolute war that lay ahead. The grief and shock that had paralyzed me in the clinic completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, highly calculated rage. I got into the car, looked at Leo in the rearview mirror, and made a silent promise to him that nobody would ever treat him as collateral damage again. We drove back to our cramped temporary apartment building. I settled Leo in the living room with his favorite silent cartoons and a healthy snack. Then I walked straight into my home office. I sat down at my desk and opened my encrypted corporate laptop. As a senior forensic auditor, my entire career was built on finding the hidden money that arrogant men tried to conceal. Bradley thought because I was exhausted and constantly distracted by Leo's medical needs, I was entirely oblivious to the financial mechanics of our household. He thought because he shouted loudly and demanded everything, I would simply cower and hand it over out of fear. He forgot exactly who he married. I cracked my knuckles and opened my secure auditing software. I logged directly into the Secure State Corporate Registry database. I pulled up the primary operating agreement and the detailed tax identification records for Apex Holdings. This was the real estate investment fund Bradley proudly claimed as his sole empire. This was the very same fund he ruthlessly demanded 100% ownership of in his divorce papers. I bypassed the public-facing documents and began digging deep into the underlying asset structures. I searched for the cross-referenced commercial loans, the hidden liabilities, and the true financial health of the man who thought he had completely outsmarted me. The next morning, I walked into the imposing downtown office of my divorce attorney, Mr. Harrison. He was a notorious shark in the Chicago legal scene, known for dragging arrogant executives through the mud and securing massive settlements for wronged spouses. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk and placed the manila envelope Bradley had given me right in the center. Mr. Harrison put on his reading glasses and began to scan the documents. The further he read down the list of Bradley's outrageous demands, the redder his face became. He read the clause demanding sole ownership of the Aspen mansion. He read the section claiming all 3 luxury vehicles. He read the demand for complete control over Apex Holdings. And finally, he read the cruelest paragraph of all, where Bradley explicitly outlined his refusal to pay child support and his demand to sever all parental obligations to Leo. Mr. Harrison took off his glasses and slammed his fists onto the heavy wooden desk with a force that rattled his coffee mug. This is an absolute insult, he growled, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He thinks he can bleed you dry and abandon his disabled child just because he hired a flashy corporate law firm. I will freeze every single one of his bank accounts by noon tomorrow. We will file for an emergency injunction on the business assets. I will drag him through a grueling 3-year court battle, and by the time I am done with him, he will be begging to give you half of everything he owns. He continued to rant, pacing behind his desk, outlining a scorched earth legal strategy designed to financially ruin my soon-to-be ex-husband. But I was barely listening to a single word he said. I tuned out his shouting entirely. Instead, my eyes were completely fixated on a single sheet of paper I had printed out from my late-night investigation. It was a highly classified internal tax filing for Apex Holdings. Hidden deep within the complex columns of depreciation and asset valuations was a specific line item that Bradley clearly thought no one would ever understand or trace. It was a massive vulnerability, a financial landmine wrapped in corporate jargon. I looked at the tax filing and then I thought about Leo. My beautiful, bright son was sitting in my cramped apartment, unable to hear the world around him. A 3-year court battle meant 3 years of frozen assets. It meant 3 years of legal fees draining whatever resources I had left. Most importantly, it meant Leo would miss the critical window for his cochlear implant surgery. I did not have 3 years to fight Bradley for a share of a supposedly wealthy empire. I needed to cut the dead weight immediately and secure my son's future. Mr. Harrison stopped pacing and leaned over the desk, pointing a finger at Bradley's paperwork. "We go to war, Natalie. I will draft the countersuit right now." I looked up from my documents and met my lawyer's furious gaze with absolute calm. "No, we will not go to war," I said softly. Mr. Harrison frowned clearly, confused by my calm demeanor. "What do you mean we will not go to war? This man is trying to leave you destitute." I slid the manila envelope back across the desk toward him. "Draft the papers exactly as he wants them," I instructed, my voice steady and unwavering. "Give him the house, give him the cars, give him 100% of Apex Holdings, but make sure he waives all parental rights to Leo. Make that waiver airtight and irrevocable." Mr. Harrison stared at me as if I had suddenly spoken in a foreign language. He dropped back into his leather chair, completely stunned. "Natalie, you cannot be serious," he pleaded. "You are acting out of shock. You are letting him bully you because you are scared and exhausted. You designed that Aspen house. You funded the startup costs for Apex Holdings with your own salary. If you sign this agreement, you are walking away from millions of dollars in marital assets. You will have absolutely nothing." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany wood. "I am not acting out of fear, Mr. Harrison. I am acting as a senior forensic auditor. I know exactly what I am giving him. I want you to draw up the settlement word for word, according to his demands. Let him take the business and the properties as is. The only thing I care about is gaining sole legal and physical custody of my son, without any future interference from Bradley. Give him his perfect victory." My lawyer looked at me for a long, tense moment. He had represented me for years in various minor legal matters, and he knew I was a meticulous professional. He saw the cold calculation in my eyes and slowly realized I was not surrendering. I was setting a trap. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Against my better judgment, I will draft the paperwork, but if you sign this, you cannot take it back." "That is exactly what I am counting on," I replied. I left Mr. Harrison's office and stepped out onto the bustling Chicago street. The cold wind whipped around me, but I felt a burning heat of determination radiating through my veins. Bradley wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate chess while discarding our family like trash. He was about to learn that playing financial games with a senior auditor was a fatal mistake. I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket and scrolled through my contacts. I bypassed the numbers of friends who would offer useless sympathy and stopped on the one person who had the power to help me detonate the bomb I had just built. I tapped the screen and initiated the call to my brother-in-law, Jamal. Jamal was 36 years old, a brilliant African-American man, married to my older sister, Clara. More importantly, for my current situation, Jamal was a highly ranked financial investigator for the IRS. He spent his days tracking down white-collar criminals, wealthy tax evaders, and men who thought they were smarter than the federal government. He answered on the second ring, his deep voice booming through the speaker. "Natalie, it is good to hear from you. Clara told me what Bradley did at the clinic. Do you need me to come over there and handle him?" "No, Jamal," I said into the receiver, my voice echoing with a dark promise. "The trap is set. I need you to pull the federal cross-collateralization records on Bradley's company." Within 48 hours of that phone call to Jamal, I was packing my entire life into standard brown moving boxes. The transition from luxury to survival mode was brutal and absolute. Bradley had given me exactly 2 days to vacate the premises before he officially changed the security codes on the custom-built Aspen mansion I had spent 3 years designing from the ground up. I had painstakingly selected every piece of reclaimed wood for the vaulted ceilings and negotiated with the architects to ensure the acoustics were perfectly optimized for a child with profound hearing loss. Now, all of that careful planning belonged to a 24-year-old administrative assistant who probably thought a mortgage was just a suggestion. Leo and I moved into a cramped, noisy 2-bedroom apartment situated right next to a busy, elevated train line in the city. The contrast between our old life and our new reality was a harsh physical blow. Every 15 minutes, the heavy rumble of the train shook the cheap drywall of our living room. The radiator clanked aggressively throughout the night, and the thin windows did nothing to block the freezing Chicago drafts. For me, the physical discomfort was entirely secondary to the emotional toll. But for Leo, the transition was confusing and frightening. Without his cochlear implants, he relied heavily on visual cues, and the chaotic vibrations of the apartment constantly kept him on edge. I spent the first few nights sleeping on the floor next to his twin bed, holding his hand until he finally drifted off to sleep. My daily routine quickly morphed into a grueling marathon of pure survival. I woke up at 4 in the morning every single day. While the city was still pitch black and freezing, I logged into my secure corporate servers and plowed through complex financial audits. By 7, I was waking Leo up, making his breakfast, and reviewing his sign language flashcards. I had to secure a specialized nanny for the hours I was mandated to be in the corporate office, which ate up a massive portion of my remaining salary. I worked late into the night, balancing my demanding job as a senior forensic auditor with Leo's specialized care. I was running on black coffee, sheer willpower, and an undercurrent of cold rage that kept my mind intensely focused on the endgame. Meanwhile, Bradley and Madison were aggressively rubbing their victory in my face. Through mutual acquaintances and completely public social media profiles, I was forced to witness their extravagant new lifestyle. Madison officially moved into the Aspen mansion before the ink on the preliminary divorce filing was even dry. She posted endless photos posing in the gourmet kitchen I had paid for, lounging by the heated infinity pool, and showing off the massive walk-in closet that was now filled with designer clothes bought with Bradley's supposedly limitless funds. They hosted lavish weekend parties serving expensive champagne to Bradley's elite real estate investors. He was playing the role of the triumphant billionaire to absolute perfection, entirely convinced he had successfully discarded his old life without a single consequence. I ignored their public gloating. I had a much more pressing crisis to manage. The countdown to Leo's rescheduled cochlear implant surgery was ticking down, and I was fighting to gather the necessary funds. I had picked up a secondary freelance contract doing late-night tax preparation for small businesses just to cover the out-of-pocket costs for his ongoing speech and occupational therapies. It was exhausting, but I was making it work. Then the real escalation began. Bradley decided that taking the house, the cars, and the investment portfolio was simply not enough. He wanted to make sure I suffered in the most agonizing way possible. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I took Leo to his weekly specialized speech therapy appointment. The receptionist, a woman who had known us for 2 years, swiped Leo's insurance card and frowned at her monitor. She tried it a second time and then looked up at me with genuine distress. She informed me that the policy had been completely terminated. The primary account holder had canceled the specialized dependent coverage effective immediately, leaving my son entirely uninsured. My chest tightened. Bradley had deliberately canceled Leo's health insurance. This was not a standard bureaucratic error. This was a calculated strike. The basic coverage provided by my employer would not cover the highly specialized pediatric specialist Leo required, and Bradley knew that fact perfectly well. He knew I was already stretching every single dollar I earned just to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. By cutting off the insurance, he was forcing me to pay out of pocket for the basic therapies that were keeping my son from regressing completely. I walked out of the clinic and paid the $300 session fee using my emergency credit card. When we got back to the noisy apartment, I sat Leo down with his coloring books and opened my laptop. I drafted a brief, highly professional email to Bradley. I swallowed my pride and laid out the facts logically. I explained that Leo's therapies were critical and requested a temporary 30-day extension on the specialized insurance policy until I could secure equivalent coverage through my own corporate provider. I did not beg, but I made it clear that this was about his son's basic medical needs. I hit send and waited. I expected a harsh reply from his legal team, or perhaps a dismissive email telling me to figure it out myself. I did not expect the sheer level of cruelty he delivered. 10 minutes later, a notification popped up on my screen. I opened Bradley's response. There was no formal greeting. There was no explanation. There was no mention of Leo or the insurance policy at all. The body of the email contained absolutely no text. It was just a single laughing face emoji. Attached below it was a high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of Bradley's wrist resting against the leather steering wheel of the new Porsche he had bought for Madison. Gleaming perfectly on his wrist was a brand new solid gold Rolex watch, easily worth the exact amount of money it would have cost to keep his son's medical insurance active for an entire year. I stared at the glowing screen, the laughing emoji mocking me, the gold watch reflecting his absolute arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his wealth and his ruthless tactics made him a god. I slowly closed my laptop, the sound echoing sharply in the small apartment. I picked up my phone and saw a secure encrypted message waiting from Jamal. The federal records had been pulled. Bradley had no idea the invisible noose was already tightening around his neck. The encrypted message from Jamal glowed on my screen, a beacon of hope in the dark reality I was currently navigating. He had successfully pulled the federal documents detailing the exact structural vulnerabilities of Apex Holdings. But before I could dive into the complex financial data, a loud, aggressive knock at my apartment door startled me. The heavy pounding vibrated through the thin walls, causing Leo to look up from his coloring book with wide, confused eyes. I patted my son on the head, offering a reassuring smile, and walked over to the heavy wooden door. Standing in the hallway was a process server. He shoved a thick legal envelope into my hands without a word and walked away. I locked the door and carried the heavy package to the kitchen counter. The return address bore the bold logo of Chicago's most ruthless corporate family law firm. It was the exact expensive, high-powered legal team Bradley had hired to completely crush my spirit and drain my remaining resources. I sliced the envelope open with a kitchen knife and pulled out a stack of dense, intimidating legal documents. As a senior forensic auditor, I was intimately accustomed to reading complex legal jargon, but the sheer, concentrated malice radiating from these specific pages was breathtaking. Bradley and his aggressive legal team had sent an official hardline demand letter. They were requiring me to immediately sign a comprehensive waiver of financial discovery. In the realm of high-stakes divorce litigation, financial discovery is the standard legal procedure where both spouses thoroughly audit each other's personal assets, bank accounts, and corporate holdings to ensure a fair and equitable division of property. It is the absolute last thing a man hiding massive amounts of toxic debt wants his professional auditor wife to participate in. Bradley was fiercely demanding that I completely waive my right to look into the financial health of Apex Holdings, the valuation of the Aspen Mansion, and the balances of his offshore investments. He wanted me to legally agree that I would accept his financial disclosures blindly, without asking a single question or launching any independent investigation whatsoever. But Bradley knew I was meticulous. He knew I would normally demand a full, uncompromising audit of every single receipt wire transfer and corporate tax filing. So to ensure I complied with his outrageous demand, his legal team included a vicious, terrifying threat. The second page of the letter was a fully drafted, ready-to-file motion for full sole custody of Leo. The legal threat was explicitly and coldly laid out. If I refused to sign the waiver of financial discovery, Bradley would immediately file this emergency motion in family court. His lawyers detailed exactly how they would drag the custody battle out for years. They promised to request endless grueling psychological evaluations. They threatened to demand multiple invasive home inspections of my cramped apartment. They knew I was already drowning in out-of-pocket medical expenses for Leo's specialized therapies. They calculated that a prolonged, brutal custody war against a well-funded opponent would financially bankrupt me within 6 short months. He was essentially holding my disabled son hostage to protect his fragile corporate secrets. Bradley did not actually want custody of Leo. He had made that perfectly clear at the clinic when he cruelly called his own child a sinking financial ship. He simply knew that Leo was my entire world. He was using the very real, terrifying threat of taking my son away as a heavy bludgeon to force me into blind submission. He expected me to panic, cave to his demands, and surrender my fundamental right to investigate his hollow, rotting empire. I read the threatening letter twice, carefully taking in every cruel sentence and calculated legal maneuver. An ordinary person would have been paralyzed by fear. An ordinary mother would have been completely destroyed by the prospect of losing her child to a wealthy, vindictive ex-husband. But I was not just a mother. I was a seasoned professional who spent my entire career setting invisible traps for arrogant men who believed they were untouchable and above the law. I sat down at my laptop, opened my email client, and began executing my countermeasure. I knew exactly how to play this psychological game. To make Bradley believe he had won, I had to give him the exact reaction he was eagerly anticipating. He expected an emotional, terrified, and completely broken woman. I needed to feed his massive ego and convince him that his brutal tactics had absolutely crushed my will to fight. I began typing my response directly to his lead attorney, making sure to copy Bradley on the email so he could witness my surrender firsthand. I deliberately abandoned my usual crisp, professional tone. I crafted a message filled with panicked, desperate language. I typed frantically, letting my sentences run on, mimicking the frantic mindset of a mother pushed to the absolute edge of despair. I begged them not to file the custody motion. I pleaded with Bradley, directly reminding him of how much Leo needed my daily specialized care and how a vicious custody battle would deeply traumatize our son. I typed out long paragraphs of fabricated desperation, stating that I was already overwhelmed with my new difficult living situation and the crushing weight of Leo's medical needs. I claimed I had neither the emotional energy nor the financial resources to wage a war against his powerful legal team. I told him he could keep the company, the house, the cars, and every single investment account he had ever opened. I wrote that I was completely terrified of losing my boy. I finished the lengthy email with a final groveling plea. I officially agreed to sign the waiver of financial discovery. I promised to waive my right to audit Apex Holdings, accepting his financial disclosures entirely as is, with no further investigation whatsoever. I begged him to just send the final settlement paperwork so we could end this horrible nightmare and I could keep my son in peace. I read over the email one last time to ensure the tone of complete pathetic submission was flawless. I took a deep breath and hit send. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow breath. I could vividly imagine Bradley sitting in the custom-built office of the Aspen Mansion reading that email on his phone. I knew he was probably laughing, showing the desperate message to his young mistress, bragging about how easily he had broken his stubborn wife. His ego would be swelling to an unmanageable size, absolutely certain of his total dominance. He firmly believed he had bullied me into total submission, blinding me with fear, so I would not look at the toxic rot beneath his corporate facade. He had completely swallowed the bait. By formally agreeing to waive financial discovery, I was giving him exactly the legal rope he needed to hang himself. He was so incredibly eager to hide his financial secrets from me that he failed to realize I already knew everything. The calculated submission was perfectly executed, leaving him completely exposed and arrogant, setting the stage for the absolute devastation that was soon to follow. The game was now completely locked in place, and there was absolutely no turning back for him. The following Tuesday morning, I sat at my sleek glass desk at the corporate auditing firm. The fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished surfaces of the downtown Chicago high-rise. I was deep into a complex tax reconciliation for a client when the mail cart rolled past my cubicle. The office manager handed me a thick, heavy envelope. It was not a standard corporate parcel. It was an oversized, obnoxious envelope made of textured cream paper and sealed with an elaborate wax stamp. The entire office floor was an open concept design, meaning at least 10 of my highly professional colleagues were sitting within earshot and could easily see the ridiculous package. I sliced the heavy paper open with my silver letter opener. Inside rested an extravagant thick piece of cardstock dripping with heavy gold foil lettering. It was an official invitation. My eyes scanned the elegant cursive font. It formally requested the honor of my presence at a lavish engagement gala, celebrating the upcoming union of Bradley and Madison. My chest tightened for a fraction of a second. My mother-in-law, Patricia, had deliberately mailed this absurd display of wealth directly to my place of employment. She knew my colleagues would see it. She wanted me to open it in the middle of a busy workday and completely break down in front of the very peers who respected my sharp analytical mind. She wanted them to whisper about the poor, discarded wife, whose wealthy husband had replaced her with a 24-year-old assistant. It was a calculated, petty attempt at public humiliation. I could almost hear Patricia laughing in her country club as she wrote out my corporate address. I did not cry. I did not run to the restroom to hide my face in shame. Instead, my eyes locked onto the very bottom of the cardstock. Printed in bold, arrogant letters was a specific phrase that made a cold, victorious smile spread across my face. The text read that this spectacular evening is proudly sponsored and fully funded by Apex Holdings. Bradley was using his company accounts to pay for his massive, self-indulgent party. By putting this in writing, he was publicly flaunting his absolute ownership and financial liability for the corporate entity he was desperately trying to shield from any legal scrutiny. He was practically handing me the exact financial rope I needed to complete my trap. I calmly placed the gold foil invitation into my briefcase, ensuring it would be perfectly preserved as evidence for the judge. That evening, I returned to our noisy, cramped apartment. I paid the specialized nanny-made dinner and started preparing Leo for his nightly routine. As I reached into his backpack for his specialized medical tablet, my hand hit empty space. Panic flared instantly in my chest. The medical tablet was not a standard device. It contained thousands of dollars worth of custom speech therapy applications, visual schedules, and specialized communication tools that were absolutely vital for his daily development. Without it, he would struggle to communicate his basic needs. I desperately tore through every box and bag in the small living room. It was nowhere to be found. I pulled up the device tracking application on my laptop. The map loaded and a pulsing blue dot confirmed my absolute worst fear. The tablet was still located at the massive Aspen mansion. I must have left it plugged into the wall in his old custom-built bedroom during the frantic 2-day packing mandate Bradley had forced upon me. I could not simply order a new one. The insurance company would take weeks to approve a replacement, assuming Bradley had not already blocked the claim. I had no choice. I had to go back to the house and retrieve it immediately. I checked the date on my phone and my stomach plummeted. Today was the exact day of the lavish engagement party. I quickly arranged for Clara, my sister, to come over and watch Leo for a few hours. I threw on a simple dark trench coat over my work clothes and grabbed my car keys. The drive out to the upscale gated community took 45 minutes every mile, increasing the cold tension running through my veins. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, steeling my nerves for the inevitable clash. When I finally turned onto the familiar winding driveway of the property I had spent years designing, I was greeted by absolute chaos. The massive iron gates were propped wide open to accommodate a fleet of commercial catering vans, luxury party rental trucks, and landscaping crews. Event staff hurried back and forth across the sprawling front lawn carrying enormous floral arrangements and crates of expensive champagne. The house was being transformed into a spectacular venue to celebrate the destruction of my family. I parked my modest sedan behind a towering delivery truck, making sure I was completely out of sight. I sat in the driver's seat, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I did not want to step foot inside that house. I did not want to see the woman who had stolen my life parading around in the rooms I had built. I knew Bradley would be inside barking orders and acting like a king in his castle. But I thought of Leo sitting in complete silence in our tiny apartment waiting for the device that gave him a voice. I stepped out of the car, blending in perfectly with the frantic event staff. I walked confidently up the stone pathway and slipped past a team of busy caterers, loudly arguing over a massive swan ice sculpture. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors of the mansion and stepped right into the belly of the beast. The grand foyer was bustling with expensive decorators hanging crystal lights. I kept my head down and slowly moved straight toward the grand staircase, fully prepared for whatever arrogant enemy I would inevitably face. I climbed the mahogany stairs, my footsteps muffled by the custom runner I imported from Turkey last year. The second floor was quiet compared to the caterer setup downstairs. I walked down the corridor toward Leo's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, expecting to grab the tablet and leave without incident. Instead, I found the master suite doors wide open across the hall, and Madison standing right in the center of the hallway. She was holding a champagne flute and admiring her reflection in a gilded mirror. She wore a designer gown dripping in crystals. It was a haute couture piece I recognized from a bridal magazine. The price tag was $15,000, the exact amount Bradley stole from our son's medical fund to make the deposit on a sports car. Now he was draining even more stolen funds to dress his young mistress like royalty, while his own child suffered in silence. Madison turned and gasped loudly when she saw me. Her shock dissolved into a nasty, triumphant smirk. She took a slow sip of champagne, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. She took in my sensible trench coat and practical work shoes, contrasting them against her glittering gown and flawless makeup. She clearly thought she conquered my entire world. "Natalie," she said, her voice echoing sharply in the empty hallway. "What a delightful surprise to see you here today. Are you here to pick up a catering shift because the service entrance is around back?" I ignored her petty insult and walked straight into Leo's old room. The walls had already been hastily repainted a sterile white, erasing the cheerful hand-painted murals I had created for my son. I spotted the specialized medical tablet sitting abandoned on a high shelf, dead and covered in construction dust. I grabbed it and tucked it safely into my briefcase, ensuring the device was secure. When I stepped back into the hallway, Madison was leaning against the doorframe, blocking my path to the stairs. "I really have to thank you, Natalie," she purred, swirling the champagne in her glass. "You made this transition so incredibly easy for us. Bradley told me you rolled over and signed the waivers without a single fight. It is incredibly refreshing to see a woman who knows her proper place in the world. You knew you could never compete with me, so you packed up your sad little life and left my house. I really appreciate you bowing out with absolutely zero drama." My hands curled into tight, angry fists inside my coat pockets. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to step forward and tear that stolen $15,000 dress right off her back. I desperately wanted to scream that she was wearing the money meant to give a deaf child his hearing back. I wanted to shake her until she understood the pure evil she was actively participating in. But I forcefully shoved that white-hot rage down into a dark, locked box inside my mind. An emotional outburst would accomplish nothing except fueling her massive, insatiable ego. I stared at her vapid, smiling face and maintained an expression of complete, chilling indifference. "You are entirely welcome, Madison," I said, my voice dangerously soft and perfectly controlled. "I sincerely hope you and Bradley get exactly the life you deserve together." I moved aggressively past her, forcing her to step aside. As I walked down the hallway, I glanced into Bradley's home office. The heavy oak door was wide open. The room was a disaster zone of scattered files, open corporate ledgers, and financial statements. Bradley had always been terribly disorganized, leaving highly sensitive documents exposed. I stepped inside the office, pretending to look for a missing charger cable. Madison scoffed loudly from the hallway and walked away, completely dismissing me as a threat. I moved swiftly toward his desk. My highly trained forensic auditing eyes immediately locked onto a specific stack of heavily redacted financial documents sitting carelessly on his dark leather blotter. I did not need to touch the papers or take any photographs. I simply engaged my intense professional focus. The top document was a fresh wire transfer authorization form linked directly to an offshore investment account. Printed clearly at the top right corner was a specific 9-digit Federal Reserve routing number, along with an associated corporate shell entity name. I burned those exact numbers and that corporate entity name permanently into my memory, locking the critical financial data away like a secure steel vault. I turned around, walked briskly out of the mansion, and drove straight back to my cramped, noisy apartment. I did not shed a single tear during the drive. I calmly fed Leo, bathed him, and tucked him safely into his small twin bed. That night, the heavy rain lashed violently against the thin windows of our living room. At exactly 9 o'clock, a sharp knock sounded at my front door. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. Jamal stood in the dim hallway, water dripping steadily from his dark trench coat. He stepped inside, shaking off the freezing rain. He did not say a single word of greeting. Instead, he reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a massive federal dossier. The cover was prominently stamped with a bright red security seal from the United States Internal Revenue Service. Jamal dropped the dossier right onto my cheap kitchen table with a resounding thud. A sharp, brilliant smile formed on his face, illuminating the dim room. "You were right," Jamal said, his voice practically humming with predatory anticipation. He leveraged the entire house and the primary holding company. He used cross-collateralization to hide a massive, toxic commercial debt. The arrogant fool was so eager to lock you out of the assets that he completely waived financial discovery. He did not read the fine print. I pulled the red stamped folder across the cheap laminate table and broke the heavy wax seal. Jamal stood beside me, his large frame casting a long shadow against the kitchen wall. I spread the classified documents out under the harsh overhead light. What lay before me was not the robust portfolio of a wealthy real estate tycoon. It was the financial autopsy of a dead man walking. I scanned the ledgers, my eyes darting across columns of numbers, interest rates, and liability disclosures. As a senior forensic auditor, reading complex financial data was my primary language. It took me less than 3 minutes to completely unravel the entire fraudulent structure. Bradley was not rich. He was drowning in a bottomless ocean of toxic commercial debt. He had executed a highly dangerous financial maneuver known as cross-collateralization. It is a predatory lending mechanism where a borrower uses multiple highly valued assets to secure one massive high-risk loan. Bradley took out a catastrophic $5 million commercial loan. To satisfy the aggressive bank requirements, he used the Aspen mansion, which we owned free and clear, as the primary collateral. But $5 million was far too much debt for just the house. So he cross-collateralized it with the entire operating valuation and cash flow of Apex Holdings. He bet our entire family foundation on one single reckless roll of the dice. I immediately cross-referenced the printed federal documents with the specific 9-digit Federal Reserve routing number I had burned into my memory just hours earlier at the mansion. It was a perfect match. Bradley had wired the entire $5 million loan principal to an obscure offshore shell entity. That entity operated an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange based in an overseas tax haven. Bradley truly thought he was an untouchable financial genius who could double the family net worth overnight in the crypto markets. But the offshore crypto market had recently suffered a devastating and highly publicized crash. That specific unregulated exchange went completely bankrupt over a month ago, permanently locking all investor funds behind a wall of federal investigations. Bradley's entire $5 million investment evaporated into thin air. It crashed to absolute zero. The reality was staggering. Bradley was fundamentally broke. He was throwing lavish engagement parties and buying luxury sports cars, using the very last remaining drops of operational cash flow from Apex Holdings. He was frantically burning through stolen medical funds to maintain his billionaire facade, completely ignoring the massive commercial loan balloon payment looming on the immediate horizon. I kept flipping through the federal dossier, my heart pounding steadily in my chest. My breath hitched when I reached the final signature page of the master commercial loan agreement. There, right next to Bradley's flashy signature, was my name. It was penned in bright blue ink. But the slope of the letters was entirely wrong. The loop on the capital N was far too sharp. The spacing between the vowels was completely unnatural. I traced my index finger over the fraudulent ink. Bradley had successfully forged my signature to secure the massive loan. He had to forge it because commercial lenders strictly require both spouses to legally consent when leveraging a primary marital residence. My husband committed a massive federal financial crime just to fund his arrogant gambling addiction. Jamal leaned over the table and tapped the forged signature with a heavy finger. "We can take this straight to the federal prosecutor right now," Jamal said, his deep voice rumbling with quiet, righteous anger. "We can have him arrested for wire fraud and forgery by tomorrow morning. He will be sitting in a federal holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit while Madison is busy trying on her expensive wedding dress." I shook my head slowly, staring intensely at the fraudulent paperwork. "No, Jamal," I said softly. "We absolutely cannot go to the authorities. Not yet." Jamal frowned, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Why not?" "He stole from you. He forged your name on a federal document. He deserves to be locked away." I explained the brutal reality of our state divorce laws to my brother-in-law. If I marched into family court tomorrow and fought him aggressively over the assets, the presiding judge would immediately freeze every single bank account associated with our names. During the discovery process, they would uncover the $5 million commercial loan. They would inevitably uncover the blatant forgery. Bradley would undoubtedly go to federal prison, but Bradley going to prison would not magically erase the massive toxic debt attached to our marital estate. Because the catastrophic loan was technically taken out during our legal marriage under the guise of expanding the family business, the family court judge would likely classify it as marital debt. Even with the proven forgery, untangling my personal financial liability from his massive fraud would take years of agonizing litigation. I would have to hire expensive forensic experts to prove I had zero knowledge of the offshore crypto accounts. During those 3 to 5 years of relentless legal warfare, my accounts would remain completely frozen. I would not have access to a single dime. More terrifyingly, depending on how the judge ruled on the principle of equitable distribution, I could still be held legally responsible for half of the outstanding balance. A 50-50 split of a $5 million toxic debt would instantly ruin my entire future. It would bankrupt me permanently before I even reached my mid-30s. Most importantly, a frozen bank account and a massive debt obligation would completely destroy any chance of paying for Leo's cochlear implant surgery. Leo would lose his hearing forever while I fought a useless, expensive war over a pile of burning corporate ashes. Bradley had unknowingly trapped me inside a burning building. But by aggressively demanding total ownership of the assets and rushing the divorce process, he was actually handing me the only safe fire escape. I looked up at Jamal, my mind operating with the icy precision of a senior auditor constructing an airtight trap. If we fight him in open court, the explosion takes us both out. I explained, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. But if I give him exactly what he demands, he takes the entire debt with him. I have to make him forcefully demand 100% of Apex Holdings and the Aspen Mansion. I have to manipulate him into signing a legally binding waiver of financial discovery so he legally assumes all hidden liabilities. He has to take the entire $5 million bomb willingly and hold it tight against his chest before it detonates. Jamal slowly smiled, realizing the sheer genius of the maneuver. How exactly do you plan to make an arrogant, greedy man demand a bomb? I stacked the federal papers neatly and placed them back into the dossier. I am going to use his massive ego against him, I replied. I am going to make him fight tooth and nail for something entirely worthless, so he blindly rushes to sign away his right to investigate the company. By the time he realizes he swallowed a poisoned apple, he will be standing in front of a judge with absolutely zero legal recourse. The next morning, I sat in Mr. Harrison's office for the second time. He looked at me with cautious optimism, expecting me to finally authorize a full-scale legal assault on Bradley's assets. Instead, I pulled out a photograph from my briefcase and placed it squarely on his desk. It was a picture of a massive, incredibly ugly modern art painting that currently hung in the grand foyer of the Aspen mansion. Bradley had purchased the hideous canvas 2 years ago from an obscure local artist. It was a chaotic mess of jagged red lines and muddy brown splashes. He paid $5,000 for it simply because a wealthy golf buddy told him that collecting abstract art was a symbol of true elite status. In reality, the piece was entirely worthless. It held absolutely no resale value, and I had always despised looking at it. Mr. Harrison stared at the photograph and raised an eyebrow. What exactly am I looking at, Natalie? This is our Trojan horse, I explained, leaning forward. I want you to draft a new response to his legal team. Tell them I am completely willing to concede the Aspen mansion. Tell them I will happily surrender all 3 luxury vehicles and walk away from every single share of Apex Holdings. Tell them I agree to his demands regarding child custody, and I will not seek a single dime of alimony. But in exchange for surrendering his empire, I demand joint custody of this specific painting. My lawyer looked at me as if I had completely lost my mind. You want to trade a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio for a piece of ugly canvas? He asked, his voice laced with disbelief. I want Bradley to think I am trading the portfolio for the canvas I corrected. You have to sell this performance, Mr. Harrison. You have to draft a ferocious legal demand. Claim that I have a deep, profound emotional attachment to this specific artwork. State that I firmly believe the artist is on the verge of a massive international breakthrough, and I demand 50% of its future appraised value. Make it sound like keeping this painting is a matter of life and death to me. Threaten to drag out the divorce proceedings for years solely over the custody of this hideous artwork. Mr. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, studying my face. He was a seasoned veteran of divorce warfare, and he slowly began to see the tactical brilliance of my plan. He realized I was setting a psychological trap designed specifically for a narcissist. He wants to break you, Mr. Harrison murmured, tapping his pen against his desk. If he believes this painting is the one thing keeping you sane, he will spend every ounce of his energy trying to rip it away from you. Exactly, I said. Bradley is a man driven entirely by ego and spite. If I simply surrendered the house and the company without a fight, his natural paranoia would kick in. He would immediately suspect a trap. He would hire forensic accountants to figure out why I was walking away so easily. He would audit his own books and eventually uncover the massive liability crisis waiting to detonate. I have to give him an agonizing legal battle to distract him. I have to make him bleed for a victory so he feels like he earned it. Mr. Harrison smiled a sharp, predatory grin. He opened his laptop and immediately began drafting the most aggressive, ridiculous legal demand of his entire career. He used highly inflammatory legal jargon, demanding immediate physical possession of the painting and threatening aggressive litigation if the canvas was harmed in any way. He made the document bleed with my supposed desperation. The misdirection worked with absolute flawless precision. When Bradley received the legal demand, his massive ego completely blinded his rational judgment. Just as I had calculated, he could not stand the thought of me securing a single victory. The idea that I desperately wanted this specific piece of art consumed his every waking thought. He completely ignored the fact that I was willingly walking away from a massive real estate portfolio. He glossed right over my total surrender of Apex Holdings. All he saw was an opportunity to inflict targeted emotional pain. Bradley immediately directed his expensive legal team to fight the painting demand with absolute ferocity. He instructed his high-priced attorneys to draft lengthy, aggressive countermotions. He hired a private art appraiser to evaluate the canvas, desperately trying to prove it belonged solely to him. He spent hours on the phone with his legal counsel strategizing how to legally deny me access to the hideous red and brown splashes. Every single hour his lawyer spent fighting over the painting cost him $800 in billable legal fees. He was actively burning through thousands of dollars of stolen corporate funds just to secure a piece of trash. And while he was entirely consumed by this petty vindictive war over a meaningless canvas, he completely ignored the massive financial landmines ticking quietly inside his portfolio. He stopped reviewing the operational ledgers of Apex Holdings. He completely forgot about the catastrophic $5 million commercial loan that was rapidly approaching its default deadline. His entire focus narrowed down to punishing me. Madison, his young mistress, unknowingly fueled his distraction. Through mutual contacts, I heard she was furious that Bradley was spending so much time and money fighting his ex-wife over an ugly painting instead of focusing on their lavish engagement party. Their arguments only made Bradley dig his heels in deeper. He had to prove he was the absolute victor in every conceivable arena. 2 weeks passed in a blur of ridiculous legal maneuvering. Mr. Harrison played his part brilliantly. He filed theatrical motions demanding the painting be placed in a climate-controlled neutral vault, pending a judge's decision. Bradley retaliated by filing an emergency injunction to keep the painting mounted in the Aspen mansion. It was a spectacular circus of wasted time and money. And behind the curtain of this chaotic distraction, I quietly maneuvered the final pieces of my trap into place. Because Bradley was so deeply obsessed with securing the painting, he aggressively pushed his lawyers to finalize the broader divorce settlement as quickly as possible. He demanded they expedite the paperwork, completely bypassing standard legal precautions just so he could officially claim the artwork as his sole property and rub it in my face. He demanded his legal team bypass the mandatory cooling-off periods. He instructed them to draft a final decree that explicitly waived all rights to mutual financial audits. He firmly believed that skipping the discovery phase was a brilliant tactical maneuver that would secure his absolute ownership of his corporate empire and prevent me from ever touching his precious modern art. He was actively speeding toward the edge of a sheer cliff, completely convinced he was driving toward a glorious sunset. My psychological warfare had paralyzed his logic, turning his malicious greed into the very instrument of his own destruction. The stage was perfectly set for the final act. On a Tuesday morning, a courier arrived at my apartment with a thick manila envelope from Bradley's legal team. Inside was the formal waiver of financial discovery, alongside a heavily modified divorce decree. Bradley had instructed his attorneys to insert an aggressive, non-negotiable clause stating that he would assume all marital business assets and their attached liabilities strictly as is. He was so blinded by his own narcissism that he actually believed he was executing the financial coup of the century. Through mutual acquaintances, I had learned exactly why he was pushing this specific language so relentlessly. Bradley had convinced himself that the offshore cryptocurrency crash was merely a temporary market correction. He firmly believed that the frozen, unregulated exchange holding his $5 million toxic loan would eventually unfreeze, bounce back, and turn his worthless digital tokens into a billion-dollar fortune. In his warped, arrogant mind, the as-is clause was his ultimate weapon. By forcing me to waive financial discovery and forcing me to surrender Apex Holdings blindly, he thought he was legally locking me out of his imminent crypto windfall. He wanted to ensure that when he eventually became a billionaire, I would not be entitled to a single fraction of a penny. He was actively hoarding a ticking time bomb, terrified that I might try to steal a piece of the shrapnel. I sat at my small kitchen table, tracing my finger over the bold legal text. The phrase "as is" highly dangerous in corporate law. It means the buyer or the assuming party accepts the asset with all its faults, known and unknown, visible and hidden. By legally claiming the business assets and all liabilities as is, without conducting a formal audit, Bradley was voluntarily chaining himself to the fraudulent commercial loan. He was formally absorbing the crushing debt that he used my forged signature to acquire. To seal his fate, Bradley sent a gloating email to my personal account just an hour after the courier departed. He wrote a lengthy, condescending message mocking my decision to surrender the company. He boasted about his brilliant business acumen and told me I was a fool for walking away from his empire just to keep full custody of Leo. He explicitly stated that he was taking total control of the finances and that I would never see a dime of his future wealth. I did not reply to his taunts. I simply saved the email, printed a physical copy, and placed it securely in my briefcase. This written admission of his deliberate financial concealment was the final key to my survival. I packed my documents, kissed Leo goodbye, as he played with his nanny, and headed to a quiet, unassuming coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. Jamal was already sitting in a corner booth, wearing a dark wool coat and nursing a black coffee. His large, imposing frame made the small cafe table look miniature. I slid into the booth across from him and handed over the printed email along with the drafted waiver of financial discovery. Jamal put on his reading glasses and scanned the paperwork. A deep, rich laugh rumbled in his chest. He shook his head, tapping the ass's claws with a heavy finger. I have investigated hundreds of white-collar criminals in my career, Jamal said, his voice low and steady. But I have never seen a man so eager to build his own financial gallows and slip the noose around his own neck. He actually thinks he is outsmarting you. He thinks he is protecting his offshore crypto billions, I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. He is terrified I might demand half of an account that currently holds absolutely zero liquidity, but I need to be completely certain, Jamal. If I sign this waiver and let him take the company, as is what happens to me when the commercial bank realizes the $5 million loan is in default and uncovers the forgery. Jamal opened his secure laptop, angling the screen so only I could see the federal tax codes displayed. That is exactly why I needed you to secure his written admission of concealment, Jamal explained. Because Bradley is voluntarily hiding his debt, forging your signature, and aggressively claiming sole ownership of the LLC. While forcing you to waive discovery, he is handing you a golden shield. Jamal pointed to a specific paragraph of federal tax law. It is called the Innocent Spouse Relief Program. The IRS and the federal courts use this specific code to completely insulate a spouse who was kept in the dark about fraudulent financial activities. To qualify, you have to prove that you did not participate in the fraud, that you did not benefit from the hidden funds, and that your spouse actively concealed the transactions from you. Jamal tapped Bradley's gloating email. This email, combined with the fact that he wired the stolen medical funds to buy his mistress a Porsche, proves you received absolutely zero benefit from his illicit cash flow. His demand for the discovery waiver proves he actively concealed the liabilities. The moment he signs this final decree in front of a judge, he legally absorbs 100% of the criminal and civil liability. The IRS will grant you full innocent spouse relief. You will be fully insulated from the federal fallout that is about to hit him. I leaned back against the vinyl booth, a profound sense of relief washing over me. The crushing weight of the $5 million fraud was finally lifting from my shoulders. The forensic audit was complete, the legal framework was flawless, and the federal protections were solidly in place. Bradley's ego had blinded him to the most basic rule of accounting. Liabilities do not just vanish because you refuse to look at them. They compound, they accrue interest, and eventually they demand to be paid. When does the federal audit trigger? I asked, my voice cold and precise. Jamal closed his laptop with a sharp click. The commercial bank reported the 90-day default to the Federal Reserve this morning. The IRS automated flagging system has already picked up the cross-collateralization anomalies. We are just waiting for the final legal ownership of Apex Holdings to be established on paper. The absolute second the judge signs your divorce decree and declares Bradley the sole owner, the federal freeze goes into effect. The trap was armed, the escape route was secured. All I had to do now was walk into the courtroom, play the role of the defeated, broken wife, and hand an arrogant man the match he would use to burn his own life to the ground. I thanked Jamal, gathered my documents, and walked out into the freezing Chicago air, ready to finalize the destruction of Bradley's hollow empire. The icy wind of the Chicago winter spattered against my coat as I walked back to my cramped apartment. I had my strategy firmly locked in place, and the federal tax codes validating my every move. Now all I had to do was wait for the final trap to be delivered. 2 days later, a heavy knock at my door signaled the arrival of a bonded courier. He handed me a thick, rigid envelope marked with the gold-embossed logo of Bradley's high-priced legal firm. I carried the heavy package to my small kitchen table, clearing away Leo's coloring books to make room for the paperwork that would determine our entire future. I sliced the envelope open and slid out the final binding divorce decree. It was a massive stack of heavily watermarked paper designed to look intimidating and absolute. Bradley and his aggressive attorneys had clearly spent hours crafting a document so thoroughly ruthless that it was intended to leave me entirely destitute. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat down under the flickering overhead light, and began to read the contract with the meticulous scrutiny of a senior forensic auditor. The sheer malice baked into the legal jargon was staggering. Section after section was dedicated to stripping away every single marital asset I had ever contributed to. Clause 4 explicitly stated that Bradley retained sole, total, and unencumbered ownership of the Aspen mansion. The lawyers had deliberately added language specifying that I was immediately forfeiting any claim to the equity, the furnishings, and the custom architectural designs I had personally financed. Section 7 dealt with the family investment fund. It declared in bold underlined text that Apex Holdings was the exclusive property of my soon-to-be ex-husband. It barred me from ever requesting a financial valuation or claiming any future profits generated by the entity. But the absolute cruelty of the document was most apparent in the sections regarding our son. Bradley had ensured his lawyers drafted a watertight waiver of all his parental rights and financial obligations. The decree explicitly stated he would pay zero alimony and zero child support. He legally classified Leo as my sole financial responsibility, phrasing it in cold, sterile terms that completely erased his own flesh and blood. He wanted to make absolutely certain that his newly acquired wealth would never be drained by medical bills or cochlear implant surgeries. He was permanently severing himself from our child to protect his fraudulent empire. I kept reading, moving past the vicious custody waivers to find the exact mechanism I needed to trigger my trap. Buried on page 42 under a dense block of property division legalese was the golden ticket, the assumption of liabilities clause. Bradley's lawyers had aggressively worded this section to demand that he was accepting all business entities and properties strictly as is. They included a heavy-handed waiver of financial discovery confirming that I was explicitly barred from auditing the corporate accounts prior to signing. In their arrogant rush to secure the fake offshore crypto millions and protect the ugly modern art painting, they had legally bound him to the catastrophic $5 million commercial loan. I ran my finger over the printed words, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline. By demanding total ownership and refusing an audit, Bradley was actively concealing his massive commercial default. He was willingly swallowing the poisoned bait. The document was a masterpiece of corporate greed, but to a forensic accountant, it was a signed confession of financial suicide. Night fell over the city, casting long shadows across the small living room of my apartment. The elevated train rumbled past, shaking the thin windows, but I barely registered the noise. I walked into the bedroom and stood over Leo's twin bed. He was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. Without his hearing aids, the loud urban chaos outside did not disturb him. I gently brushed a lock of dark hair away from his forehead. He had been so brave through all the abrupt changes and the confusing medical appointments. I looked at my beautiful son and thought about the $45,000 surgery he desperately needed. I thought about the $60,000 Bradley had stolen to buy a luxury sports car for a 24-year-old mistress. I thought about my wealthy mother-in-law Patricia mocking my dedication to my disabled child. The anger that had been simmering inside me solidified into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I was not just signing a divorce decree tonight. I was signing an execution warrant for a man who believed his family was disposable. I walked back to the kitchen table and smoothed out the final signature page of the divorce decree. I picked up my favorite heavy black ink pen, the same one I used to sign off on massive corporate audits. My hand did not shake. My heart did not race. I felt absolutely nothing but the icy precision of a professional executing a flawless strategy. I signed my name on the designated line. My signature was clear, strong, and completely unwavering, but I did not stop there. Underneath my signature, in a tiny, precise script, I added a specific numeric code. It was the exact federal reference number linking directly to the innocent spouse relief application Jamal had helped me prepare. It was a microscopic legal tag that officially registered my compliance under federal tax law, proving I was signing this document under the condition of concealed financial liabilities. It was a tiny detail that Bradley's arrogant lawyers would completely ignore, assuming it was just a meaningless processing note or a clerical stamp. They would never bother to run that specific sequence of numbers through a federal database. They were too busy celebrating their perceived victory to look closely at the ink. I gathered the signed documents, placed them back into the return envelope, and sealed it tight. I set the package by the front door, ready to be mailed back to his legal team first thing in the morning. The paperwork was complete. The waivers were signed. The trap was fully armed and locked. The only thing left to do was walk into the courthouse, let the judge strike the gavel, and watch the entire illusion of Bradley's wealth burn to ashes. The morning of the final hearing arrived with a biting chill that swept off Lake Michigan, rattling the windows of my rented apartment. I stood in my bedroom long before the sun came up, listening to the distant rumble of early commuter trains. Today was the day. Weeks of meticulous planning, sleepless nights analyzing corporate ledgers, and the agonizing performance of playing the defeated wife culminated in the next few hours. I did not feel fear. I felt the absolute cold clarity of an auditor about to present a terminal finding. I walked to the closet and pulled out the protective armor selected for this occasion. Bradley and his legal team expected me to walk into that courtroom looking entirely destroyed. They anticipated a weeping mother wearing wrinkled clothes begging the judge for a shred of mercy. They wanted the visual confirmation that they had broken me. Instead, I dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored navy blue suit. It was the exact suit I wore when delivering findings of massive corporate fraud to executive boards. I pinned my dark hair back into a severe, sleek twist. I applied my makeup with clinical precision, ensuring my face remained a flawless, unreadable mask. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who possessed the power to dismantle a hollow empire with a single stroke of a pen. I moved to the small kitchen table where my leather briefcase sat waiting. Inside the main compartment lay the signed divorce decree, the document that formally surrendered the Aspen mansion, the luxury cars, and total ownership of Apex Holdings directly to Bradley. It was the ultimate symbol of my supposed capitulation, but the true weapon was concealed in the hidden zippered compartment at the back of the briefcase. I picked up a heavy manila folder and slid it into that hidden pocket. This folder contained the federal tax documents Jamal had procured from the IRS databases. It held the irrefutable proof of the $5 million commercial loan default, the offshore cryptocurrency routing numbers, and the cross-collateralization records that tied Bradley's entire net worth to a toxic dead asset. Most importantly, it held the federal confirmation code tying my signature on the divorce decree directly to the Innocent Spouse Relief Program. I zipped the briefcase shut. The leather bag felt incredibly heavy in my hands, weighted down by the sheer magnitude of the financial destruction it carried. I walked into the small living room, where Leo was sitting on the rug playing quietly with his building blocks. His specialized nanny had arrived early to take him to his speech therapy appointment. I knelt down on the worn carpet, wrapping my arms tightly around my son. He could not hear the words I whispered into his hair, but he felt the fierce protective squeeze of my embrace. He smiled and signed the word for love. I signed it back, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Today, I was securing his future. By the time I returned to this apartment, the crushing threat of Bradley's financial ruin would no longer hang over our heads. The money for the cochlear implant surgery would be safe, and Bradley would be permanently legally severed from our lives. I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, descending the noisy stairwell of the apartment building for what I hoped would be one of the last times. The drive to the downtown civil courthouse took exactly 42 minutes in the heavy Chicago morning traffic. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, completely immersed in a state of absolute focus. I visualized the layout of the courtroom. I anticipated the smug, victorious grin that would undoubtedly be plastered across Bradley's face. I pictured his wealthy image-obsessed mother Patricia sitting in the gallery ready to witness my total humiliation. I imagined his young mistress Madison, dripping in designer jewelry purchased with stolen medical funds, eagerly waiting for the judge to officially declare Bradley a wealthy, unencumbered bachelor. They were all walking voluntarily into a slaughterhouse, completely blind to the falling blade. I pulled into the parking garage across from the imposing judicial complex. The towering stone pillars of the courthouse loomed against the gray winter sky. It was a building designed to intimidate, to make ordinary people feel small and powerless in the face of the law. But as I grabbed my briefcase and stepped out of my modest sedan, I felt larger than the building itself. I was not a victim seeking justice from a broken system. I was the architect of my own retribution. The freezing wind whipped at my coat as I crossed the busy street and approached the wide concrete steps leading up to the main entrance. My sensible heels clicked sharply against the stone, a steady, rhythmic march toward the final showdown. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, projecting an aura of untouchable professional authority. Every step brought me closer to the moment of vindication. I allowed the gravity of this execution to settle deep into my bones. Just as I placed my foot on the first concrete step, a sharp vibration echoed from the pocket of my coat. I pulled out my cell phone. The screen flashed with a secure incoming call. It was Jamal. I answered the phone and pressed it to my ear. "I am walking up the steps now," I said, my voice cutting through the howl of the Chicago wind. "Tell me everything is in position." His deep voice delivered the exact update I needed to hear, vibrating with a tense excitement. "The IRS audit trigger is locked and loaded," Jamal stated. "The second the judge strikes the gavel, his accounts are frozen." I disconnected the call and slid the phone back into my coat pocket. The freezing wind whipped my hair, but my core was burning with a quiet, controlled fire. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the civil courthouse and stepped into the cavernous marble lobby. The air inside smelled of floor wax and anxious sweat, the standard scent of broken marriages and shattered lives. I bypassed the lingering crowds and rode the elevator up to the Family Law Division on the 14th floor. I walked down the long corridor, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the polished stone walls. I spotted courtroom number 412. I took a deep breath, straightened my navy suit jacket, and pushed open the heavy wooden double doors. The atmosphere inside the room was immediately suffocating. It was thick with the kind of tension that precedes a major corporate bloodbath. I walked down the center aisle and took my seat at the petitioner table on the left side of the room. Mr. Harrison, my divorce attorney, was already there, pulling thick stacks of documents from his leather satchel. He gave me a brief, tight nod. He still thought I was making the biggest mistake of my life, but he was a seasoned professional who followed his client's explicit instructions. A loud burst of arrogant laughter echoed from the hallway just before the courtroom doors swung open again. Bradley swaggered into the room. He did not walk, he paraded. He wore a brand new bespoke charcoal gray suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly, projecting the image of an untouchable real estate tycoon. He was flanked by 3 expensive corporate lawyers, all carrying sleek briefcases and wearing matching expressions of predatory confidence. They looked like a pack of wolves circling a wounded deer. Trailing right behind the legal team was Madison. She strutted down the aisle as if it were her personal runway. She wore a tight, inappropriately short white dress that screamed desperation. Around her neck and wrists, she was absolutely dripping in heavy diamond jewelry. I recognized the necklace. It was a custom piece Bradley had commissioned using the exact funds he had siphoned from our joint savings account mere weeks before draining Leo's medical fund. Madison took her seat in the gallery directly behind Bradley's table, crossing her legs and shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Next to Madison sat Patricia, my wealthy, image-obsessed mother-in-law. Patricia wore a sharp tweed suit and clutched a designer handbag tightly in her lap. When her eyes locked onto mine, her lips curled into a nasty, venomous sneer. She glared at me with absolute contempt, clearly relishing the spectacle of my supposed downfall. She was fully prepared to watch her son strip me of every single asset I had helped build over the last 7 years. She wanted to see me broken, destitute, and completely humiliated. I simply held her gaze for a fraction of a second, offering a blank, emotionless stare, before turning my attention to the back of the room. Sitting quietly in the very last row of the gallery, completely removed from the circus of Bradley's entourage, was Jamal. He wore a crisp, dark suit and a neutral expression that gave absolutely nothing away. Resting securely on his lap was a heavy, reinforced briefcase containing the federal IRS execution orders. We did not exchange a verbal greeting. We did not nod. But the brief, intense eye contact we shared across the large room was all the confirmation I needed. The federal trap was primed. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the court bailiff commanded everyone to rise. Judge Carter entered the courtroom. She was a stern, gray-haired, no-nonsense woman with decades of experience cutting through the petty squabbles of wealthy fighting couples. She took her seat, adjusted her reading glasses, and opened the massive file containing our final divorce decree. The entire courtroom sat down in unison. The silence in the room stretched on for several agonizing minutes as Judge Carter meticulously read through the binding document. I watched her eyebrows slowly rise toward her hairline. Her frown deepened with every single page she turned. She flipped back to the asset division summary, her eyes scanning the brutal, lopsided terms Bradley's lawyers had ruthlessly drafted. She looked at the clause awarding him the Aspen mansion. She looked at the clause surrendering Apex Holdings. She looked at the complete waiver of spousal support and the immediate termination of his parental rights to Leo. Finally, Judge Carter took off her glasses and placed them on top of the file. She folded her hands and directed her piercing gaze straight across the room, locking eyes directly with me. She ignored Bradley and his expensive legal team entirely. "Mrs. Williams," the judge began, her voice echoing with a sharp, authoritative edge. "I have presided over family law for 22 years. I have seen hundreds of complex, high-net-worth divorces. But I must state on the official record that this is one of the most incredibly lopsided, irregular settlement agreements I have ever encountered in my entire career on the bench." Bradley's lead attorney stood up, straightening his expensive silk tie. "Your Honor, both parties have reviewed the terms independently and have mutually agreed to a clean, swift separation of assets to minimize unnecessary legal expenditures." Judge Carter slammed her hand flat against the desk, silencing the lawyer instantly. "I am not speaking to you, counselor. I am speaking to the petitioner." She turned her sharp gaze back to me. Her expression was a mixture of deep concern and judicial suspicion. "Mrs. Williams, you are a highly educated professional. According to these documents, you are the primary custodian of a young child with significant ongoing medical needs. Yet you are signing away 100% of the marital estate." The courtroom was dead silent. Madison leaned forward in her seat, eager to watch the judge finalize the transfer of wealth. Bradley shifted in his chair, leaning back with an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He clearly thought the judge's shock was a testament to his own brilliant, ruthless negotiation skills. He believed he had intimidated me so completely that even a seasoned judge was stunned by the absolute totality of his victory. He shot a quick, triumphant glance over his shoulder at Patricia, who offered a satisfied nod in return. They were reveling in the public validation of their greed. "You are accepting zero alimony." Judge Carter continued, her voice rising in disbelief. "You are completely surrendering a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. You are forfeiting all ownership stakes in Apex Holdings. You are explicitly waiving your fundamental legal right to financial discovery, meaning you are allowing your husband to take these businesses exactly as they are without verifying their actual worth." Do you fully comprehend the permanent, devastating financial consequences of this document? Judge Carter leaned forward, resting her forearms on the elevated bench. Her voice softened slightly, adopting a tone of genuine maternal warning. Mrs. Williams, I must ask you directly on the record. Are you being coerced into signing this agreement? Has anyone threatened your physical safety or the safety of your child? Because once I strike my gavel and sign this order, you cannot come back to this court in 6 months, claiming you made a mistake under duress. You will walk out of this building with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back and full financial responsibility for your son. I need you to be absolutely certain you want to proceed with this highly irregular surrender. Section 14, 1,000 words. I held Judge Carter's piercing gaze. The silence pressed down on everyone present in the courtroom. I knew the judge was giving me a final opportunity to back out a chance to claim coercion and tear up the settlement. Jamal sat perfectly still in the very back row of the gallery, waiting for the legal mechanism to lock into place. Before I could confirm my certainty, my husband's lead attorney decided to seize the floor. He could not resist the urge to turn my silent compliance into a theatrical victory lap. Mr. Caldwell, his slick attorney, stood and buttoned his suit jacket, flashing a condescending smile. Your Honor. If I may clarify, he began, his voice dripping with arrogance. There is absolutely no coercion taking place here today. This agreement is entirely equitable considering this marriage. My client, Mr. Bradley Williams, is a visionary real estate developer. He built Apex Holdings from the ground up through his brilliance and work ethic. The petitioner lacks the business acumen to manage a commercial real estate portfolio. She contributed nothing of material value to the corporate entities or the Aspen property. Her professional experience is limited to crunching basic numbers behind a desk. Granting her equity would destabilize the company. She walks away with exactly what she earned, which is nothing. She signed the waiver because she knows she has no claim to his empire. The sheer audacity of the lawyer's statement caused a murmur to ripple through the gallery. But the true display of narcissism was yet to come. Bradley, unable to let his paid lawyer take all the credit for his perceived triumph, suddenly stood up. He pushed his leather chair back, roughly eager to cement his dominance on the official court record. Furthermore, Your Honor! Bradley interjected, his voice loud and brimming with toxic pride. He completely ignored the basic rules of courtroom decorum, pointing an accusing finger directly at me. Let us be perfectly clear about the custody arrangement. I am voluntarily waiving all of my parental rights to our son Leo. I am doing this to ensure a clean, permanent break so I can focus on my new life. The boy requires specialized surgeries, endless speech therapies, and constant coddling. Bradley paused, making sure his young mistress Madison and his mother Patricia were watching his ruthless display of power from the gallery. I am a man building a global financial legacy, he declared coldly. I absolutely will not be held financially hostage by a disabled child. She demanded to keep him, so she assumes the total financial burden of his defective condition. My wealth will not be drained to fix a lost cause. The assets remain entirely mine, unencumbered by any future medical child support claims. That was my strict condition for this swift settlement. A collective gasp echoed from the back of the courtroom. The sheer cruelty of a father calling his own 6-year-old deaf son a defective lost cause on a permanent legal record was staggering. Judge Carter's face hardened into a mask of pure judicial disgust. She gripped her wooden gavel tightly, glaring down at Bradley from the elevated bench. Beside me, my attorney, Mr. Harrison, was shaking with barely contained rage. He leaned toward me, whispering frantically that we needed to halt the proceedings immediately and strike Bradley's comments from the record. But I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not let the vicious insult to my child break my composure. I knew Bradley's massive ego had just handed me the ultimate weapon. By explicitly stating on the federal record that he was severing all ties to protect his assets from Leo's medical bills, he was legally barricading himself away from the $2 million blind medical trust my grandfather had set up specifically for Leo. He was permanently locking himself out of the only clean money left in our family. I placed a calming hand on Mr. Harrison's arm, signaling him to stand down. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my navy blue suit, ensuring my posture was completely rigid and projecting absolute professional authority. I reached forward and pulled the small desktop microphone directly toward my mouth. The sharp screech of the microphone feedback instantly silenced the whispers in the gallery. "Your Honor." I spoke clearly, my voice ringing out with crisp analytical precision. "I want to address the court and confirm my intentions. I am not under any duress. I am not being coerced. I am executing this agreement with complete clarity of mind." I turned my head slightly, locking my eyes directly onto Bradley. His smug smile wavered for a fraction of a second as he met my cold, calculating gaze. "I surrender 100% of the marital assets," I declared into the microphone, enunciating every single syllable for the court reporter. "I formally relinquish all claims to the Aspen Mansion. I surrender all ownership stakes, voting rights, and equity in Apex Holdings. I concede the luxury vehicles and the investment portfolios directly to my ex-husband." I paused, letting the weight of my total surrender fill the silent room. Bradley's chest puffed out in absolute triumph. He shot a grinning look back at Madison, but he did not realize I was carefully wrapping the financial noose tightly around his neck. However, I continued, my voice dropping an octave, becoming sharper and heavier. "I want it stated clearly on the official legal record, without any ambiguity, that my ex-husband is assuming sole ownership of these corporate entities and real estate properties under the exact terms his lawyers demanded. He is taking them strictly as is. He is willfully accepting these assets along with all attached and hidden financial liabilities, known and unknown, public and private. He takes the crown, and he takes every single shadow attached to it." Bradley let out a loud, mocking laugh. He waved his hand dismissively. To him, my precise legal phrasing was nothing more than a pathetic attempt to save face in front of the gallery. He thought I was throwing around corporate buzzwords to make my surrender look like a calculated exit. He could not stand my composure, so he cut me off before I could finish. "Yes, obviously," Bradley barked, leaning over his heavy table and glaring at me with venom. "I take it all. I take the company, the house, and every single piece of paper attached to them. I built this empire, and I will not let you stand here and pretend you understand my business. Sign the paper and get out of my life." His attorney, Mr. Caldwell, chuckled softly. "Your Honor," Mr. Caldwell said smoothly, "my client fully understands the terms of the Assumption of Liabilities Clause. We drafted it ourselves to ensure a clean break. The petitioner is simply trying to secure the last word. We ask that the court accept the agreement as written, so my client can finally move forward without further delay." Judge Carter looked down at Bradley with severe disapproval. She recognized his toxic pride perfectly. She picked up her pen, tapping it slowly against the thick stack of divorce documents. "Mr. Williams," the judge said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch, "you are forcefully demanding that this court execute a binding waiver of financial discovery. You are explicitly demanding that you assume all corporate and personal assets exactly as they currently stand. By doing so, you are legally binding yourself to any and all debts, liens, and federal liabilities tied to Apex Holdings and the Aspen property. Once I sign this order, those burdens are yours alone. Do you comprehend the absolute finality of your request?" Bradley did not hesitate. His greed had consumed his rational thought process. He was utterly convinced his hidden offshore cryptocurrency accounts were about to explode in value, and he was terrified that delaying the divorce would give me a chance to claim his imaginary fortune. "I comprehend it perfectly. Your Honor," Bradley answered proudly, puffing out his chest. "I accept all terms and all liabilities. I want the decree finalized right now." Judge Carter stared at him for a long, heavy moment. She then turned her gaze back to me. She saw the absolute, unshakable calm radiating from my posture. I gave her a single firm nod. The judge let out a heavy sigh, signaling the end of the inquiry. "Very well," Judge Carter announced. The court finds both parties are entering this agreement voluntarily. The petitioner has explicitly waived spousal support, and the respondent has legally severed his parental rights and obligations. The property division will proceed exactly as drafted by the respondent's legal counsel. The court clerk walked the heavy stack of documents over to our tables. I picked up my pen and signed my name on the final page, pressing the ink firmly into the paper. I made sure my federal reference code was perfectly legible right beneath my signature. I handed the paperwork back to the clerk, severing myself completely from Bradley's toxic, rotting empire. The clerk carried the documents to the defense table. Bradley snatched the pen and signed his name with a massive theatrical flourish. He practically shoved the paper back at the clerk, his eyes burning with absolute triumph. The documents were handed up to the elevated bench. Judge Carter meticulously reviewed the signatures. The courtroom held its collective breath. The only sound was the scratching of the judge's pen as she endorsed the final pages of the divorce decree. She gathered the paperwork, aligned the edges, and picked up her heavy wooden gavel. "It is so ordered," Judge Carter declared. The gavel struck the sounding block with a loud, sharp crack that echoed off the marble walls. The sound signaled the absolute legal death of my marriage. But more importantly, it signaled the irrevocable, legally binding transfer of a $5 million catastrophic commercial debt directly onto Bradley's shoulders. The trap was officially sprung and the heavy steel doors had just slammed shut behind him. The courtroom immediately erupted into a sickening display of celebratory arrogance. Bradley jumped out of his chair, threw his arms in the air, and let out a loud whoop of victory. He turned around, grabbed Madison by the waist, and pulled her into a deep, passionate kiss right in the middle of the courtroom. Madison giggled loudly, wrapping her arms around his neck, her cheap diamond jewelry sparkling under the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked over Bradley's shoulder and shot me a nasty, gloating wink, thoroughly convinced she had just won the ultimate jackpot. From the front row of the gallery, Patricia stood up and began clapping her hands. My former mother-in-law was applauding the destruction of her own grandson's family. She beamed with pride, looking at Bradley as if he had just conquered the entire world. She turned her nose up at me, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, celebrating the fact that the burdensome disabled child and his demanding mother were finally erased from their wealthy lineage. Bradley's expensive corporate lawyers shook his hand, clapping him on the back and congratulating him on securing such a masterful, aggressive settlement. They packed their briefcases with smug, self-satisfied smiles, believing they had just executed a flawless legal strategy that completely outsmarted a naive, emotional wife. I did not move. I stood quietly at my table watching their pathetic, grotesque celebration unfold. I watched Bradley bask in his false glory. I watched Madison parade her stolen wealth. I watched Patricia applaud her own son's impending doom. I remained perfectly still, a silent, calculating observer, waiting for the precise moment when the federal reality would inevitably crash down upon them and shatter their arrogant illusions into a million irreparable pieces. The courtroom air was thick with the suffocating scent of unearned victory. Bradley continued his pathetic display of affection with Madison near the gallery railing while Patricia beamed from her front row seat. Mr. Harrison stood beside me at our table, packing his files with heavy, frustrated movements. He still believed we had just handed a massive fortune to a monster. I placed a reassuring hand on my lawyer's shoulder and gave him a knowing look. The time for waiting was officially over. I picked up the secondary manila folder from the hidden compartment of my briefcase. This was the dossier Jamal had delivered, the collection of federal tax documents and commercial banking ledgers that proved the absolute insolvency of Apex Holdings. I stepped away from the petitioner table and walked slowly across the center aisle of the courtroom. Mr. Caldwell, Bradley's lead attorney, was busy snapping the golden clasps of his expensive leather briefcase shut. He wore the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just executed a flawless legal victory. He had bullied a mother out of her marital assets and secured his wealthy client a clean break. He was already calculating his massive bonus. He did not even bother to look up as I approached the defense table. He simply assumed I was coming over to offer a tearful, desperate plea or a bitter final remark. He let out a condescending sigh, clearly annoyed that I was interrupting his moment of professional triumph. I stopped right in front of him. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of emotion. I simply dropped the heavy manila folder directly on top of his closed briefcase. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the leather cut through the celebratory noise of Bradley's entourage. "You might want to read the addendum to the property deed, counselor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm pitch. "And perhaps you should review the updated liability disclosures for Apex Holdings before you pop the champagne." Mr. Caldwell scoffed, rolling his eyes. He reached out to push the folder away. "Mrs. Williams, the judge, has already signed the final decree. The assets are solely owned by my client now. There is absolutely nothing left to discuss, and no addendum you fabricated will change the ruling. I suggest you open this folder," I insisted, my gaze boring directly into his smug face. "Unless you want to explain to the federal court why you facilitated the transfer of fraudulent commercial assets without conducting basic due diligence." The word fraudulent made his hand freeze. As a high-priced corporate attorney, his entire career depended on maintaining a pristine legal reputation. The sheer confidence in my voice triggered a sudden, sharp alarm in his mind. He glanced over his shoulder to ensure Bradley was still distracted by Madison. Then, with visible reluctance, he flipped open the cover of the manila folder. The very first document staring back at him was the official default notice from the commercial lending bank. It was heavily stamped and verified, detailing the catastrophic $5 million loan Bradley had taken out against the Aspen Mansion and Apex Holdings. Mr. Caldwell's eyes darted rapidly across the page. He read the cross-collateralization terms. He read the 90-day delinquency status. He turned to the second page, revealing the federal routing numbers that proved the loan principal had been wired entirely to an offshore cryptocurrency exchange, an exchange that had officially filed for international bankruptcy over a month ago. I watched the exact moment the devastating reality crashed down upon his legal mind. He realized instantly what the as-is clause truly meant. By fiercely demanding that Bradley take total ownership of the LLC and the real estate without a financial audit, he had legally bound his own client to a bottomless pit of toxic debt. He had built a flawless legal cage and locked his client inside with a ticking bomb. The color completely drained from Mr. Caldwell's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His breath hitched in his throat, and his hands began to shake violently. The papers rattled against the mahogany table as he desperately flipped through the remaining federal tax documents, searching for a loophole that did not exist. He saw the innocent spouse relief confirmation code I had appended to my signature. He realized I was completely legally insulated from the fallout. He had been completely outsmarted by a senior forensic auditor. Bradley finally pulled himself away from Madison. He strutted back toward the defense table, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket with a look of supreme arrogance. He expected to see his lawyer packing up, ready to head to a lavish celebratory lunch. Instead, he found Mr. Caldwell gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Bradley frowned, his celebratory mood faltering for a fraction of a second. "What is going on here?" Bradley demanded, shooting me a look of pure venom. "What did she hand you? Tell her to get out of our way, Caldwell. We are done here." Mr. Caldwell did not immediately respond. He could not tear his eyes away from the catastrophic banking ledgers. His hands were trembling so severely that he dropped the folder back onto the desk. The papers spilled out, revealing the bright red federal stamps. Caldwell Bradley barked, stepping closer and slamming his hand on the table. "What is wrong? Why are you shaking?" Mr. Caldwell slowly looked up. The arrogant, slick corporate lawyer was gone. In his place was a man looking at a guaranteed malpractice lawsuit and the total financial annihilation of his client. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a terrified whisper that carried through the suddenly quiet courtroom. "Bradley," Mr. Caldwell choked out, his eyes darting frantically between the documents and my ex-husband. "You did not read the commercial loan defaults. The cryptocurrency exchange went bankrupt. The money is entirely gone. You forced her to sign the waiver of discovery. You demanded the company as is. Bradley, you just assumed $5 million in toxic federal debt. My voice cut through the stunned silence of the courtroom like a blade of solid ice. Congratulations, Bradley, I said, projecting my words so every single person in the gallery could hear the absolute finality of his ruin. By forcefully taking 100% of Apex Holdings under the Assumption of Liabilities Clause, and by explicitly demanding that we waive financial discovery, you just legally absorbed the $5 million offshore loan you defaulted on 90 days ago. You thought you were protecting a massive cryptocurrency windfall. Instead, you just shackled yourself to a rotting financial corpse. Bradley stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face just moments earlier melted away, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked frantically at his lead attorney, Mr. Caldwell, demanding an explanation. "Fix this," Bradley commanded, his voice cracking with sudden terror. "Tell the judge there has been a mistake. Tell her I did not agree to take on fraudulent debt. Tear up the divorce decree right now." He reached across the heavy mahogany table, trying to grab the manila folder from his lawyer's trembling hands. Mr. Caldwell physically recoiled from his own client, backing away from the table, as if Bradley were suddenly infectious. "I cannot fix this, Bradley," the lawyer stammered, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. "You explicitly instructed our team to bypass the audit. You demanded the asset transfer exactly as is. You signed the final decree under oath in a federal courthouse. The judge just struck the gavel, making it a legally binding order. You own the company, and you own every single cent of that toxic debt. There is absolutely no legal mechanism to reverse a finalized judgment that you aggressively championed." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Patricia, my former mother-in-law, dropped her designer handbag onto the hard marble floor. The sharp clatter echoed loudly, but she did not even flinch. Her face turned a sickly shade of ash gray as she stared at her golden child. The successful billionaire real estate developer she had been bragging about to her elite country club friends was suddenly exposed as a massive fraud, drowning in insurmountable commercial debt. Madison, the young mistress, wearing the stolen $15,000 dress, gripped the wooden railing of the gallery, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "You thought you were so incredibly brilliant, Bradley," I continued, stepping out from behind the petitioner table. "You forged my signature on those commercial loan documents because you knew I would never consent to leveraging our paid-off home for an unregulated offshore gamble. You believed you could bully me into giving up everything to keep my son. You assumed my exhaustion as a mother made me blind to your financial crimes. But I am a senior forensic auditor. Finding the toxic rot hidden inside arrogant men is exactly what I do for a living." Bradley's chest heaved as he struggled to process the magnitude of his catastrophe. "You are on that loan too, Natalie," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "It was taken out during our marriage. The bank will come after you just like they will come after me." I smiled, a cold, calculating smile that made him take a physical step backward. "No, Bradley, they will not. By rushing this divorce, forcing the discovery waiver, and securing my signature under the documented condition of concealed liabilities, I automatically qualified for the Innocent Spouse Relief Program. The federal government recognizes you acted alone. I am completely insulated from your fraudulent fallout," I declared. "But that is not even the best part of your spectacular defeat today. You see, Bradley, your massive ego and your deep cruelty just saved my son's life." Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide with desperate confusion. "You stood in this courtroom on the official record and called your own flesh and blood a defective lost cause. You explicitly and voluntarily severed all of your parental rights because you were absolutely terrified that Leo's medical bills would drain your imaginary fortune." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him. "And because you permanently severed your parental rights on the record today, you cannot touch the $2 million blind trust my grandfather left exclusively for Leo's medical care." The entire courtroom went dead silent. "The very trust I was waiting to unlock until you were legally out of our lives is now completely safe from your greedy hands. My grandfather knew exactly what kind of man you were. He specifically structured that medical trust so that any parent with a legal claim could potentially access the principal. If I had unlocked that money while we were still married, or while you still maintained legal custody, you would have drained every single penny to pay off your catastrophic crypto debt. You would have stolen Leo's hearing all over again just to save yourself. So I kept it completely hidden. I let you think I was entirely destitute. I let you think I was begging you for a temporary extension on his specialized health insurance. I let you laugh at me while you wore your shiny new gold Rolex. I played the pathetic discarded wife perfectly so you would gladly throw your son away. You thought you were cutting loose a sinking financial ship? I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. But you actually just severed your only possible lifeline. The $2 million is now permanently locked away for Leo's cochlear implants and his future education. You have absolutely zero legal standing to petition the trust. You traded a guaranteed fortune for a piece of ugly modern art and $5 million in federal debt. You wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing, Bradley. Congratulations. You succeeded in leaving yourself with less than nothing. Your absolute greed became the perfect instrument of your own permanent destruction, and I did not have to spend a dime. Bradley's face contorted into a mask of feral rage. The realization that he had willingly trapped himself behind an impenetrable legal wall completely shattered his meticulously crafted facade. He lunged forward, slamming his fists onto the heavy wooden defense table with a deafening crash that made his own attorneys flinch. "You cannot do this to me!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking as it echoed off the high marble ceiling. He pointed a trembling finger at my face, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "This is a shared marital debt. We were married when I signed those commercial loan documents. You are my wife. You are legally responsible for half of that $5 million. You cannot just walk away and leave me holding the bag for a federal default." I stood perfectly still, watching him unravel. "I am not your wife, Bradley," I reminded him, gesturing to the freshly signed documents sitting on the clerk's desk. "The judge just struck the gavel. Our marriage is legally terminated. And as Mr. Caldwell so eloquently argued just moments ago, you demanded to assume all assets and liabilities precisely as they stand. You fought tooth and nail for this exact outcome." Bradley spun around to face the bench, his eyes wide with wild, unchecked desperation. "Your Honor, you have to reverse the decree. I was misled. She committed fraud by omission. She knew about the default, and she hid the federal tax codes from me. I demand we tear up this agreement and restart the financial discovery phase immediately." Judge Carter stared down at him with an expression of absolute, unyielding stone. She adjusted her robe and leaned forward, projecting the full, crushing weight of judicial authority. "Mr. Williams, you stood in my courtroom not 10 minutes ago and proudly declared you fully comprehended the terms of your agreement. You aggressively demanded the waiver of financial discovery. You explicitly ordered your legal team to draft the assumption of liabilities clause. I warned you about the permanent devastating consequences of this document, and you arrogantly dismissed my concerns." She picked up her gavel and pointed the wooden handle directly at him. "There is absolutely no fraud by omission here today. There is only a man who was so blinded by his own greed that he willfully refused to audit his own corporate ledgers. The decree is signed, sealed, and entered into the permanent federal record. I will not reverse a legal judgment simply because you just realized you outsmarted yourself. You own Apex Holdings, and you own the $5 million default. This court is finished with your property division." Bradley let out a guttural, panicked yell. He grabbed his lead attorney by the lapels of his expensive suit, shaking him violently. "Do something, Caldwell. File an injunction. Call the commercial bank. We have to freeze the transfer before they lock the accounts." Mr. Caldwell aggressively shoved Bradley's hands away, smoothing his ruined suit jacket. The lawyer's face was still a sickly pale gray. "I cannot do anything," Bradley the attorney shot back, his voice dripping with sudden venomous distance. "The bank already triggered the default. The funds are gone. And since you just absorbed $5 million in toxic debt, it means you have absolutely zero liquid capital to pay my firm's retainer. I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel effective immediately." The betrayal from his own hired gun sent Bradley stumbling backward. He looked around the courtroom wildly searching for any remaining lifeline. His eyes darted to Madison, but she was shrinking back against the gallery wall, clutching her stolen diamond necklace as if she were trying to shield herself from the blast radius. It was at this exact moment of total chaotic collapse that the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Jamal stepped out from the last row of the gallery. My brother-in-law moved with the terrifying, purposeful stride of an apex predator who had finally cornered his prey. His dark suit was immaculate. His large, imposing frame commanded immediate authority. The courtroom fell completely silent as he walked straight down the center aisle. He bypassed the murmuring spectators, his heavy leather shoes striking the marble floor with deliberate, measured thuds. Jamal reached the low wooden divider that separated the gallery from the legal tables. He did not ask for permission to pass. He unlatched the swinging gate and stepped directly into the restricted legal arena. Bradley's remaining junior lawyers immediately tensed instinctively, taking a step back from the massive, furious man approaching their table. Bradley turned around, his eyes wide with confusion. "Who the hell are you?" Bradley demanded, attempting to muster a shred of his former arrogance. "Get out of here. This is a closed legal proceeding." Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He stopped 3 feet away from Bradley, reached inside his perfectly tailored suit jacket, and pulled out a solid leather credential case. With a swift, practiced motion, Jamal flipped the case open, flashing a heavy, gleaming gold shield. "I am Special Agent Jamal Reynolds, with the United States Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." Jamal announced, his deep voice resonating with absolute, uncompromising federal authority. The remaining color drained from Bradley's face. He stared at the federal badge as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. In the gallery, Patricia let out a loud, strangled gasp, clapping her hand over her mouth. "Bradley Williams." Jamal continued snapping the credential case shut and slipping it back into his pocket. "As the now legally confirmed sole owner of Apex Holdings, you are officially under federal investigation for wire fraud, cross-collateralization forgery, and massive federal tax evasion. You utilized fraudulent signatures to secure a commercial loan, and you willfully diverted those funds into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange to evade federal tax liabilities." Bradley shook his head frantically, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "No, you do not understand. I can pay it back. I just need time. The crypto market will recover. I have the Aspen house. The house is worth millions. I can liquidate it today." Jamal offered a cold, predatory smile that mirrored my own. "You cannot liquidate anything, Mr. Williams. The IRS has officially executed a total asset freeze across your entire financial portfolio. We have seized the corporate bank accounts. We have seized the luxury vehicles you claimed today, and we have placed an immediate federal lien on the Aspen property. You do not own a mansion anymore. You own a federal crime scene." The reality of the federal seizure crashed down on the courtroom like a physical weight. "You thought you were a genius for leveraging a paid-off property?" Jamal continued, stepping closer so Bradley had nowhere to retreat. "But you forged a signature on a federally insured loan document. That elevates your little real estate scheme from a civil dispute into a Class B federal felony. You transmitted those funds across international borders, adding wire fraud to the charges. And by utilizing Apex Holdings as a shield, you triggered a corporate tax audit that will tear apart every single business dealing you have executed for the past 7 years." Jamal reached into his secure briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of federal warrants stamped with bright red seals. He dropped them aggressively onto Bradley's table right next to the finalized divorce decree. "Every single dollar you attempt to move, every account you try to access, and every asset you try to sell is now under federal jurisdiction." Jamal stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. You have absolutely zero access to capital. You cannot pay your lawyers. You cannot pay your mortgage. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee without federal authorization. The illusion is over, Bradley. We are seizing it all. The silence that followed Jamal's declaration was profound, a heavy vacuum sucking the air straight out of the room. Then reality fractured completely. The courtroom descended into absolute unbridled chaos. The sheer gravity of the federal warrants sitting on the defense table acted like a detonator blowing Bradley's meticulously crafted world to pieces. In the gallery, Patricia let out a sound that was half shriek and half breathless gasp. The impeccably groomed matriarch, who had spent the entire morning sneering at me and eagerly anticipating my total financial ruin, suddenly grasped the horrifying truth. Her son was not a billionaire titan of industry. He was a federal criminal facing years in a penitentiary, and the wealth she so proudly flaunted to her elite country club circle was entirely fraudulent. She stood up, her knees buckling wildly beneath her tweed skirt. She clawed at her throat, gasping desperately for air as a full-blown panic attack seized her chest. With a dramatic, piercing scream that echoed off the high marble walls, Patricia's eyes rolled back into her head. She collapsed rigidly into the wooden pews, fainting dead away. The courtroom bailiffs immediately rushed toward the gallery to attend to the unconscious woman, their heavy boots thudding against the polished floor, yelling for emergency medical assistance. But Bradley did not even look back at his collapsed mother. His frantic, terrified eyes were locked entirely onto Madison. The 24-year-old mistress stood frozen near the wooden gallery railing. The smug, victorious smirk she had worn while parading her $15,000 designer dress had completely vanished. Madison was not a financial expert, but she clearly understood the terrifying weight of the words federal investigation, asset freeze, and wire fraud. She looked at the towering stack of red-stamped federal warrants, then looked at Bradley's pale, sweat-drenched face. The luxurious fantasy she had happily destroyed my family to acquire was instantly dissolving into a terrifying legal nightmare. She realized with sudden brutal clarity that she was not marrying a wealthy real estate mogul. She was tying herself to a broke, disgraced felon, drowning in $5 million of toxic commercial debt. Madison's face twisted into a mask of pure revulsion. "You lied to me!" Madison shrieked, her voice shrill and piercing enough to cut through the commotion in the gallery. "You told me you were loaded. You told me she was the one dragging you down. You are completely broke. You are going to federal prison." Bradley reached out a trembling hand toward her. "Madison, please, baby, just wait a minute. My lawyers can fix this. I can move some money around." "You do not have any money!" Madison screamed back, stepping away from him as if he were covered in toxic waste. "The federal agents are seizing everything. You bought my car with stolen funds. I am not going down for your federal crimes." With frantic, trembling fingers, Madison grabbed her left hand and violently yanked the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. The ring, purchased with the exact funds Bradley had ruthlessly drained from Leo's medical savings account, caught the harsh courtroom light for a brief second. Madison wound up her arm and hurled the heavy diamond directly at Bradley's chest. The ring struck his lapel with a sharp thwack and clattered loudly onto the polished marble floor, spinning wildly before coming to a dead stop near his expensive leather shoes. Madison did not wait for him to speak another word. She picked up the hem of her designer skirt, spun around, and sprinted out of the courtroom as fast as her heels could carry her, shoving past the rushing bailiffs and completely abandoning the man she claimed to love. Bradley stood entirely alone in the center of the chaos. His legal team had abandoned him. His mistress had fled in terror. His mother lay unconscious in the gallery. The federal government had seized his entire existence. The imposing, untouchable real estate developer was completely gone. In his place stood a hollow, terrified shell of a man staring directly into the absolute abyss of his own making. His legs simply gave out. Bradley dropped to his knees right in the middle of the courtroom floor. The sharp crack of his kneecaps hitting the solid marble echoed loudly, but he did not seem to feel the physical pain. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, scrambling desperately across the center aisle until he reached the edge of my petitioner table. He reached out with shaking, sweaty hands, gripping the wooden edge of my desk as if he were a drowning man clinging to a floating piece of driftwood. "Natalie, please." Bradley sobbed, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is a massive mistake. Tell the judge you want to amend the divorce decree. We can reverse the waiver of discovery right now. We can split the debt. You are an auditor, you know how to restructure these things. Please, Natalie, you have to save me." I looked down at the man kneeling in front of me. Tears were streaming freely down his face, completely ruining his perfectly styled appearance. Snot ran from his nose. He was hyperventilating, begging me to rescue him from the exact financial trap he had so eagerly demanded to enter. "I can be better," Bradley pleaded, his voice breaking into a hysterical, wretched sob. "I swear to you, I will be a better husband. I was just overly stressed. The business loans were making me crazy, and Madison was just a stupid, meaningless distraction. I will sell everything. I will live humbly. I love you, Natalie. I have always loved you. We built that Aspen house together. We built a life together. You cannot just let the IRS take me away to a federal penitentiary." He reached out, his trembling fingers hovering just inches from the fabric of my navy blue suit, too terrified of my cold demeanor to actually touch me. He looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, attempting to play his absolute, final, most desperate card. "Think about Leo," Bradley wept, his voice dropping into a manipulative, choking whisper. "Think about our son, Natalie. A young boy needs his father. You cannot let your son grow up knowing his father is sitting in a federal prison cell. I love him. I will pay for his cochlear implant surgery. I will find the money somewhere. I will be a real dedicated father to him. Please, for Leo's sake, you have to amend the legal paperwork. Just tear up the decree and take me back." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words was breathtaking. Less than 30 minutes ago, standing in this exact same courtroom on the official federal record, he had coldly referred to our beautiful, bright son as a defective lost cause. He had explicitly demanded the total severance of his parental rights so he would never have to pay a single dime toward the medical bills. And now, kneeling on the floor facing the total annihilation of his freedom and his wealth, he dared to use the son he had just legally discarded as a shield to protect himself from federal prosecution. I stared down at his pathetic, weeping face. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a flicker of sorrow or regret. My heart remained as cold and precise as the financial ledgers I audited every single day. I had meticulously planned this execution, and I was going to finish it. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling on the marble floor. He was clutching the hem of my tailored suit jacket, his knuckles white, his face smeared with tears and desperation. This was the same man who had confidently paraded his mistress through the halls of the house I designed. The same man who had stolen the very funds necessary to grant our son the gift of hearing. The same man who had just legally and permanently discarded his child on the federal record because he thought a disabled boy would damage his wealthy aesthetic. I stepped back, forcing his hands to drop from my clothing. I looked down at him without a single shred of empathy. My voice was calm, steady, and loud enough for the approaching bailiffs to hear perfectly. "I told you, Bradley," I said, letting the absolute finality of the statement ring through the chaotic courtroom. "I gave you exactly what you asked for. You got the house, the cars, and the company. I get the son. It is a fair trade." I turned my back on him. I did not look at the heavy federal warrants sitting on the table. I did not look at Patricia, who was now being loaded onto a medical stretcher by the emergency response team. I looked directly at Jamal. My brother-in-law gave me a firm, respectful nod. Jamal stepped forward, his federal badge gleaming in the harsh light. I watched as he pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking around Bradley's wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Jamal calmly read him his rights, his deep voice overpowering Bradley's frantic, pathetic sobbing. We walked shoulder to shoulder down the center aisle of the courtroom. Behind me, Bradley began to scream. It was a high guttural sound of pure panic as the federal agents and court bailiffs grabbed his arms and forcefully hauled him to his feet. He thrashed and yelled my name, begging for a second chance, but I kept walking. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors and stepped out into the crisp, quiet hallway, leaving the rotting remains of my marriage locked inside that room forever. 1 year later, the morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new downtown corner office. The frosted glass door bore a sleek silver logo that read, Williams Forensic Auditing. After the spectacular public collapse of Apex Holdings, my professional reputation had skyrocketed. Corporate boards across Chicago realized that if I could legally and flawlessly dismantle a $5 million federal fraud scheme orchestrated by my own husband, I was exactly the kind of relentless auditor they needed to protect their assets. My consulting firm was fully booked for the next 2 years, and I was currently expanding my team to handle the massive influx of high-profile clients. I sat behind my custom glass desk, sipping a hot cup of black coffee, reviewing a quarterly risk assessment for a major tech company. The crushing anxiety of living in a noisy, freezing apartment was nothing but a distant memory. I had purchased a beautiful, quiet home in a safe suburban neighborhood. There were no rattling trains or freezing drafts, just a massive fenced backyard where Leo could run and play without a single worry. The transition from survival mode to actual thriving life was miraculous. I was completely financially independent, professionally respected, and most importantly, entirely free. The heavy office door swung open. The sound of rapid, joyful footsteps echoed across the polished hardwood floor. I looked up from my financial reports and smiled as my son bounded into the room. Leo was 7 years old now, taller, stronger, and practically vibrating with vibrant, happy energy. He ran straight around the desk and threw his arms around my neck, burying his face in my shoulder. Nestled securely behind both of his ears were his brand new, fully paid-for cochlear implants. The surgery had been a complete and total success. The $2 million blind medical trust, perfectly insulated from Bradley's greed, had easily covered the specialized operation, the top-tier surgical team, and the extensive ongoing speech therapies. Leo pulled back and looked directly into my eyes. He did not need to use his hands to communicate his feelings today. He took a deep breath, focusing his developing vocal cords, and spoke aloud. His voice was bright, clear, and absolutely beautiful. "I love you, Mom," Leo said, pronouncing every single syllable with careful, deliberate pride. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but they were tears of overwhelming, triumphant joy. "I love you too, my sweet boy," I replied, pulling him into another fierce embrace. I had fought a brutal psychological war against a ruthless enemy, specifically for this exact moment, and I had won everything that truly mattered. While Leo ran over to the large windows to watch the city traffic below, I picked up my digital tablet from the desk. A breaking news alert flashed across the financial section of the Daily Times. The headline was bold and uncompromising. I read the text with a profound sense of closure. Bradley sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, Aspen Mansion auctioned off to pay federal debts. The article detailed how the federal government had systematically liquidated his entire fake portfolio. The custom-built Aspen Mansion, the property he loved more than his own son, had been sold at a public foreclosure auction for a fraction of its value, just to satisfy the commercial bank. The article even mentioned that his personal assets were seized, including a notoriously ugly modern art painting that was ultimately appraised at $0 and thrown into a federal evidence storage locker. Bradley had lost absolutely everything. His mistress had vanished into the wind. His mother had been completely humiliated in her elite social circles. He was currently sitting in a tiny concrete federal cell, stripped of his bespoke suits and his arrogant delusions. The empire he tried to steal had crushed him entirely. Sometimes the best way to defeat a greedy person isn't to fight them for the assets, but to hand them the very anchor that will pull them under. Have you ever had to step back and let karma or the IRS do the heavy lifting for you? Share your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of surviving the unimaginable. Remember, your independence is your strongest weapon. The gripping story of Natalie's strategic triumph over her ruthless ex-husband offers a profound lesson on the nature of conflict. True power does not always require shouting the loudest or fighting the hardest. In fact, the most effective way to defeat a profoundly greedy and narcissistic individual is often to step back and let their own hubris do the work. When faced with an agonizing betrayal involving the theft of her disabled son's medical funds and a callous divorce, Natalie could have reacted with immediate and predictable rage. Instead, she chose the path of calculated patience. This narrative teaches us that in the face of profound injustice, our initial instinct to wage a scorched earth war might actually trap us in the chaos the toxic person thrives on. Bradley expected a desperate fight over assets, which would have fueled his ego and drained Natalie's resources. By giving him exactly what his greed demanded, through total ownership of a rotting empire, she legally insulated herself and her son. The lesson here is about the sheer power of emotional detachment. When we remove our ego from a toxic battle, we can see the hidden vulnerabilities of our opponents. Greed is inherently blinding. By stepping aside and refusing to play a rigged game, we allow the toxic individual to confidently march into a trap of their own making. Ultimately, Natalie's victory was born from her independence and her unshakable focus on what truly mattered. Her child's future and her own peace were secured through strategy rather than emotion. It reminds us that walking away is not a sign of weakness, but a masterful display of strength. Take a moment today to evaluate the toxic battles in your own life and ask yourself if stepping back might actually be your most powerful move. Then share your thoughts on finding strength in silence in the comments below.